There's a lot of weirdness in this text, and I think it might have helped if I had specified which translation for Dan to read, because I was working mostly from particularly the Common English Bible, which is like a grade 7 reading level Bible. And that was definitely an older translation, so that might have amplified the weirdness a little bit. But that line about weirdness, that came from a podcast episode from Yale Divinity, where they look at a passage from the lectionary briefly every week. And this week they did this Mark text. And I think that's a pretty good assessment of this text. Most of it is pretty familiar if you've been around the church for long, but that doesn't make it that much less weird. There are a lot in there that feel like they're non sequiturs, jumping from loosely related ideas. And I suspect most sermons using it end up zoning in on one particular part of it and focusing on that instead of trying to treat it as one whole. And when I first read it in preparation for today, the part that I zoned in on was the first section, with specifically that punchline, "Whoever is not against us is with us." And there was also a Numbers text in the lectionary for today that I did not include, chapter 11, verses 4 to 29, that had a parallel story. As the disciples do with Jesus here, Moses' assistant Joshua comes up to Moses and tells Moses to stop a couple people from prophesying. And like Jesus in the Mark story, Moses doesn't see it as a problem at all. He's instead glad that others are also doing good work and warns Joshua to not be jealous for his sake. And there's a good lesson there about celebrating those who are acting in line with our values, even if they aren't active in our church or any church. And that was it. That was the whole original sermon idea. Unfortunately, for those of you who think sermons are too long, I kept thinking about these texts. And I kept thinking about the general state of Christianity in North America. And I kept coming across books and podcasts that seemed to have relevant things to say. In fact, I kept thinking about them enough that, in combination with worship committee needing to juggle the schedule a little bit, this changed from one sermon into two. So I will also be speaking again next week, continuing where I leave off today, but from a slightly different direction. And I'll also use that as an opportunity just to say that my notes will be available on the Rockway website after this. There's always one or two people who ask me afterwards if they can get a copy of it. So once I have a chance to share them with Stephanie, they'll go up on the site and be available there. So first, in looking into this Mark text, I wanted to see some more context around that Mark passage to try to connect some of these seemingly disconnected pieces. Sometimes it's easy when we mostly encounter the Bible in these little segments to forget that these stories were pieced together the way that they were for a reason. The Bible didn't originally have the section headers that we have now, though they're put in by modern translators and they don't even always agree with each other. It didn't even have chapter and verse numbers for a long time. For that matter, it didn't even have punctuation in the original Greek. Mark is just one long book. So I found that the section before the lectionary text is helpful for getting some more framing. There, Jesus says that he will be killed and then rise again. The disciples don't get it. So, of course, they don't ask any follow-up questions, which is a great way to continue to not get it. Then the disciples were debating with each other about who is the greatest. Jesus tells them that whoever wants to be first must be least of all, and calls in a nearby child to emphasize the point. Whoever welcomes one of these children in his name welcomes him. So that is some of our thematic context. The disciples are trying to position themselves to be near the top of the hierarchy of the Jesus followers. And Jesus tries to teach them to reverse their thinking, to prioritize the marginalized instead, particularly in this case, children. With that in mind, I think a lot of that conflict is carrying forward into today's text. So we see that the disciples were not upset with what this other person was doing. They weren't upset that demons were being cast out. They weren't even upset with this exorcist's attitude doing it. They say that he was doing it in Jesus' name. And that phrase is easy for us to read as if the name Jesus or Christ or Christian is a magic word. And that is often how we use it today. Sometimes, if we're being honest, when we end a prayer with "in Jesus' name," we're thinking of it that way, like it's going to make it more likely that we get what we want. But also more to the point here, it's often used as a magic word by others like politicians or social influencers. And in that context, they use it to manufacture consent. They mean things like, "We're the good guys. You should vote for us. You definitely shouldn't be upset about the terrible things we're doing, because we're the Christians, and that's all that really matters." I'm going to be talking about that group some more next week. But in that cultural context, the phrasing "in the name of" means more like a representative of. If you do something in the name of a king, it means you're doing what the king wanted you to do. A modern twist close to that might be "don't shoot the messenger." If the messenger is relaying what somebody with higher authority told them to do, and you don't like the message, then the person you're really upset with is the higher authority, not the messenger. So when the disciples are saying that this exorcist is doing it in Jesus' name, they probably mean that he was doing it in a way consistent with Jesus. So the disciples acknowledged that this exorcist was doing a good thing for the right reasons, but they were still upset because he wasn't following us. He's outside of their perceived in-group, outside of their desired power structure. And like the previous passage, Jesus again conveys that they've missed the point. They need to flip their concept of power. We're talking about two groups here. There are people who are in the Jesus institution, for lack of a better word, who are doing good work. And there are people who are inspired by Jesus, but not part of the institution, who are also doing good work. And obviously, there's a lot of other categories in the world, some of which we'll get back to in part 2 next week. But in the modern world, that latter group is often those who decided that they just couldn't put up with all the problems of the church, but are still compelled by Jesus in some way. And this is a substantial group, mainly because the church has messed up a lot. There's a lot of reasons why people might have problems with Christianity. Even within these themes of hierarchy and power, there's a lot to work with, past and present. Crusades, witch hunts, inquisitions, colonialism, residential schools, many aspects of the current wave of Christian nationalism. We could go on and on. This quest for power, in both the disciples and in the modern church, is usually backed up by what Brian McLaren calls a cult of innocence in his book, Do I Stay Christian? To justify that your group should rule over other groups, you need to believe that your group is the correct, pure group, and the other groups are evil that must be punished, or at the very least, inferior that must be controlled. And it's really easy for me to hear that and think, yeah, I'm so glad I don't have that attitude like some other people. I'm so glad I'm one of the good guys. I'm never judgmental like those bad guys. We have to stop them. And then I realized that I just did my own cult of innocence thinking. It's a human temptation. It's not unique to some other group of people that we don't like. It's one that we aren't immune to, and the more that we think we're immune to it, the more likely we are to fall into it. That brings us back to the second part of the Mark text. In my experience, a lot of the time I have heard this passage quoted, or the equivalent Matthew passage, started at verse 43. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, and so on. I think I heard that a lot as a teenager and young adult. Growing up, kind of on the fringes of the purity culture movement. I wasn't getting nearly the worst of it. My church was pretty good, but especially as the internet became a thing, I picked up more and more of it. And it was used to sell things like monitoring software on your computer to make sure that you weren't accessing pornography. The text was interpreted that you should cut off the ways that you individually sin. And of course, the only real sins worth talking about are the sexual ones. And I don't want to completely squash the general idea there, because there is some wisdom in being able to identify your weak points and to have the self-control to avoid them. But also, the extreme focus on sex was bad, and even the more general version is maybe missing some context here. The context here for Mark is somebody who has harmed a child, or in an interesting bit of phrasing, has caused a child to sin. In that case, the thing that we're talking about needing to be cut off might be more about harmful power structures or the attitudes that support them within our communities, not about individual computer access. They need to be cut off before they become ingrained in the next generation, causing them to then continue the cycle of violence. And for me, this is where the cult of innocence attitude jumps right back in again. See, this text tells me to cut off all those terrible Christian nationalists. They are obviously harming the marginalized and amplifying these cycles of violence. So I should spend my free time on the internet, making sure to tell strangers about how those aren't the real Christians, not like I am. Then I check myself again, because for one, arguing with strangers on the internet is usually counterproductive. But I think more importantly, it leads into that much bigger problem of strengthening that cult of innocence. And today we are observing Truth and Reconciliation Day, including in the second hour for those who are able to stay. And I've heard this cult of innocence come up in conversations around that too. It usually goes something like, those who committed the atrocities in the residential schools or in other aspects of colonialism, they were doing what they thought was a good thing at the time. And it's probably true that a lot of them did, because they were in this cult of innocence thinking. They believed that obviously they were superior, and so they had not only a right, but maybe even a responsibility to enforce their way on others. But when we say that as an excuse, as a way to look away from the atrocities, we are refusing to acknowledge the harms that have been done. And we are setting ourselves up to do similar harms out of that same cult of innocence, because we haven't addressed the root of the problem being our sense of superiority. And that's the kind of scenario where this language about needing to cut off a part of the church body might come into play. It's cutting off the part of the church that might allow abuse. It's cutting off the pursuit of power over and against others. It's cutting off the superiority of my group over their group. And the Mark text feels like a strict binary. And that's not unusual for rabbis of that time to speak in hyperbolic ways. In practice, all of this can get messier. It isn't always clear what constitutes abuse of power and what is a difference of opinion about some complicated moral question. Sometimes it's clear, but not always. And there is some bad history that many of you know, from Mennonites and elsewhere, of rushing to apply the ban or church discipline to way too many things, banning anybody who doesn't fit the high standard of the community. And this then creates the power structure in the other direction, where the church is now the abuser of the person that they've kicked out. To speak in very broad generalities, a lot of conservative churches today would err on that side, quick to cast out somebody who doesn't follow all the rules sufficiently. A lot of liberal churches have the opposite problem, where they are afraid of standing up for anything in case they go too far or in case they alienate somebody who's already in the community. And in doing so, they can end up supporting an abusive status quo as well. And I think that's the idea at the end of the reading, about the salt losing its saltiness. If there isn't some unique substance to a community that makes it safe for the oppressed, they might end up through passivity with the same result as the overly aggressive, power-seeking community. But there was another text read today, and I acknowledge doing both was a little longer than our average. But I included the James reading and not the Numbers one I mentioned, because I thought this James text provided some needed balance. The emphasis in this one is on restoration, bringing somebody back into community, rather than cutting somebody or something off. And two things about this community are named. One is that they confess their sins together, and two is that they pray together and sing together. And I think those two components are a valuable part of this bigger discussion of how do we retain our saltiness against this domination mentality without falling into that mentality ourselves. Confessing our sins together helps combat that cult of innocence. That quest for power, that desire to rule over others, it needs that fuel of feeling superior to them. And when we have a culture instead of being able to admit when we've messed up, or the things that we're struggling with, how we're working together to do something better, it's a lot harder for that cult of innocence to be able to take hold. It's hard to want to dominate others while having a true sense of your own weaknesses. Not in a shameful way, not going back to the purity culture stuff, just an honest one. Several years ago, we were doing a series on the Mennonite Confession of Faith. Apparently, I am a glutton for punishment, taking hard topics that nobody else wants to talk about. Because this week and next week are things like discipline and nationalism and Christian identity. That time I looked at the Confession of Faith and I promptly signed up for the article on sin. After talking about confession and repentance in some more detail than I did today, Scott got up for the congregational prayer and jokingly asked if anybody wanted to make a big public confession. So to be clear, that's not what I'm talking about. Unless maybe it's a case where you harmed the whole community, then you might need to apologize to the whole community. But for the most part, I'm talking more about the kinds of things that were highlighted a bit a couple weeks ago about the horizontal caring community. Ideally, there would be someone or a small group of people within the church that you feel safe talking to about those things that you're struggling with, or the way that you've harmed somebody and trying to figure out how to make it right with them. And a big part of the work of a local church is fostering an environment where those kinds of relationships can form and that include everybody. The other idea from the James text is praying together and singing together. And these are both ways to build a sense of community and shared values, to align our priorities with each other, with wider Christian tradition, and with God. They help us define ourselves as ourselves in a positive way. We're not primarily defined by being better than them. Instead, we are asking, what do we stand for? What is the kind of community that we want to be? When you have a clear vision of what you are, not only who or what you are against, your attention can be focused there in the center instead of on the boundaries trying to police who is and isn't good enough to get in. And a few years ago, we had an exercise explicitly like this. We developed as a church a vision statement that in part says, "We continue to grow and learn as we seek to live Christ's wisdom and peace in the world." And over time, I've grown to like that statement more and more. because we have a clearly defined positive center, Christ's wisdom and peace, and we acknowledge that we won't always get it right, but we will keep growing together. We've been in an interesting time as a congregation for a few years, basically since soon after that statement was formulated. COVID stopped us from meeting in person for a year and a half. Some who used to be regulars never came back. Some are joining us online for any of a few very good reasons, not just COVID. Our pastor of many years left. We had some time with an interim pastor arrangement. Then Thomas fully took over, which in some ways is a brand new thing, and in other ways feels very familiar. In a lot of these kinds of transitional times, a community is just trying to tread water, to keep the pieces from falling apart. And I would like to thank everybody who put in so much time keeping the pieces from falling apart. But those transitional times also give us an opportunity, a chance to zoom out a bit and ask how we want to define ourselves. Not just what we stand against, not that cult of innocence pride that we aren't like them, but what do we stand for? And it's that tension where I will pick up more next week.